Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of the City of Rome lecture series. For those of you who haven't met me already, I am Alice Poletto, Chris's assistant on this year's edition of the City of Rome course. And tonight we are pleased to welcome an alumnus of the City of Rome, Dr. Carlos Machado from the University of St. Andrews, who also happened to be Robert's assistant on the course. So he's basically the older edition of myself. Before taking on his position at St. Andrews, Carlos held positions at the University of São Paulo, where he taught history after completing a DPhil at the University of Oxford with a solid background knowledge obtained in the University of Niterói, is that correct, in São Paulo, in history and economic history. Carlos' research interests are primarily revolving around late antiquity, particularly in Rome and Italy. He's published a lot on the evolution of urban space, on senatorial aristocracy, on religious transformations with particular regard to Christianity, on honorific monuments and civic life, and on domestic spaces. So he's been addressed late antiquity from every possible perspective. His current works are on the role of portraits and visual culture in urban life in late antique Italy, and most importantly, a focus on the history of poverty in late antiquity, which we are hoping to know more about tonight. So without further ado, behold Carlos Machado on Let Them Eat Cake, Surviving Poverty in Late Antique Rome.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm still regretting the title. I was trying to do something different rather than the usual descriptive, boring titles I suggest, and I really couldn't come up with anything better than this, but I hope it will make sense as I go along. So good evening, everybody. It's a great honor to be here speaking to you, especially to the students of the City of Rome course. I always find it very hard to start any talk here at the British School because my initial impulse is to tell you how much this place means to me, but this would take too long, and I don't think that's why the students are here. As the students and I have already had a chance to discuss, I first came to Rome to do this mini course some 22 years ago, and my life has never been the same since. Every time I return to Rome, I meet a new generation of students, and every time I am reminded of how transformative this place has been for me. Here I found my topic for a PhD, here I found my career, I made excellent friends, I met my wife, so I owe everything to this place. So I would like to thank Chris and Alice for inviting me to speak to you, and all the friends here at the school for their hospitality, which has been tremendous over the past few weeks. But especially I would like to thank the City of Rome students who have made the last few weeks such a joy. Seeing your excitement every morning as you leave for another visit, and your happiness when you return, even last Wednesday when you came back drenched from your visit to Ostia, that can lift anyone's spirits. In the little time we have spent together, you have reminded me of how much I have to learn about Rome and how exciting that can be. And it's in the spirit that I'm going to talk about poverty. The image you see on the slide is an illustration of some of the issues I want to address tonight. So you can see two agricultural workers, a not very usual sight on Roman art. I thought this would be a good way of introducing the topic of this talk. Poverty was an omnipresent issue in ancient Rome, and working was one of the ways of trying to survive it. But this is a representation that comes through a number of mediations, and we cannot see the poor without them. This image comes from the mausoleum of Trebus Justus on the Via Latina, datable to the middle of the 4th century. Justus was not a poor man. His hypogeum was decorated with beautiful frescoes that show him in all his glory, surrounded by what are presumably his wife and son, as well as by images of workers. These images were not produced to celebrate the virtue of hard work, nor to commemorate the memory of the workers, but to tell us something about Eustace himself. So what I want to do here is to explore the presence of the poor in late antique Rome, but I want to start by emphasizing that very often we do it through the eyes of the elite. We try to go beyond that, but that's an issue that is looming over everything I say here. Poverty was ubiquitous in the past, and it still is today. We see it everywhere, and yet we overlook it. We see people sleeping in the rough or begging, and we treat them as a sign of economic decline or dysfunction. We see them as the residue discarded, but not properly removed by our society. Now, we do the same when we look at ancient Rome, our eyes firmly set on grand monuments and inscriptions, on emperors and senators. But can we go beyond that? Can we write a history of poverty in late antique Rome that captures some of the agency of the poor and that pays proper attention to their formative role in that society? Now, I don't have definitive answers to these questions, but I want to explore a few ways of doing it. As you will see, my argument will be very broad, and I will rush from one question to another, but this is for a specific purpose. I want to show you the complexity of the subject and the wealth of the evidence in the first place. But crucially, I want to pay tribute to the work done by great archaeologists and scholars who are changing our view of the late antique world. So please bear with me. So in order to discuss these issues, I will follow the structure you see on the slide. I will start with a brief presentation of what I am looking for when I talk about poverty. I will then explore the impact of poverty drivers in late antique Rome, before finally turning to the different strategies used by the poor to survive it. In the end, I will return to my initial question and consider what was the role played by poverty and the poor in the definition of the city and the social structure that we call Rome in late antiquity. So it is a very, very broad overview of what I hope at some stage will be turned into a book, but it's still in a very early stage. So let me start with what I won't do. I won't follow the approach you see on the slide. This is a very influential approach. It's used by a number of international institutions, economic institutions, and governments. And basically, it's an attempt to measure poverty by establishing what we call a poverty line. So you have a reliable way of identifying who is poor, how many people are poor, and then you can formulate policies to deal with that. The problem, and even the World Bank acknowledges that, is that this reduces poverty in the first place to an economic issue. In the second place, and this is what really bothers me, is that it treats poverty as essentially a static condition, objectifying the poor. Leaving aside the problem of how we would replicate these calculations for the ancient world, and trust me, people have tried, there is also the problem that we don't really know how many people lived in Rome at any given moment, nor what proportion of the population was experiencing poverty as conditions changed. So I want from the start to leave aside any attempt at a quantitative approach to the issue of poverty. Late antique thinkers and writers were aware of these difficulties. The passage you see on the slide is quite long. I'm not going to read it, but I took this as an example from Ambrose of Milan's De Officiis, which is a treaty he wrote to educate the clergy of Milan. And one of the things he says there is that identifying the poor that you have to help is not really easy because it's not obvious, it's not evident. And he raises the issue of the people who weren't poor but are experiencing poverty now. Many times not because for fault of their own, but just because life is doing it to them. So these authors, and Ambrose is not alone in having this kind of sophisticated sensitivity to the issue. In this sense, our late antique writers are very close to some very interesting modern literature on poverty. And I just put 4 books there that I found very inspirational, but also highly readable. Christian writers often return to this same set of ideas. Poverty is a dynamic process, the result of various forces, from taxation to disease. People react to these changes in different ways, and it is nearly impossible, even for parish priests, to find out who is experiencing hardship. besides emphasizing the dynamic nature of poverty, ancient and modern writers have also shown us that poverty impacts a much larger population than those we would consider the poor. The second book you see there, published by Rank, Eppard, and Bullock, really startled me when they showed that, at least in their estimation, some 60% of all Americans, North Americans, experience poverty in one stage in their lives, which is a really powerful reminder of doesn't matter if you're born poor, you might face it at some stage. Different groups develop their own strategies for surviving poverty. Many fail, and all of them combine more than one strategy. So this means that we cannot fully understand the impact of poverty if we don't consider poverty drivers, that is, the processes that push people down, but also the portfolios of strategies used by the poor to escape poverty. So we need to look at the two processes, pushing down and then fighting to stay up. Now, one of the most common observations among scholars studying late antique poverty is that very often our sources are talking about the people who aren't really poor. A very good example of this are these two letters of Gregory the Great, both of them from 591. Now, how can we consider the aunt of Gregory the Great, Lady Pateria, or the widow of Felix, Lady Viviana, mentioned in the first letter, poor? They clearly aren't what we would consider poor, but Gregory treats them as poor. Gregory tells his correspondent in the second letter that Philomuth was blind and suffering from a shortage of provisions, but calls him filium viri dignissimi, son of a most worthy gentleman. Now, these are very extreme cases. I don't think we need to worry too much about them. But even these privileged members of Italian society in the late 6th century were exposed to the dynamics of poverty. Focusing on the dynamics rather than on the actual poor, than the destitute defined by an objective measurement, makes things easier for us because we can look at social processes which affect everybody, not just those that we would see as poor. But I will develop that in a minute. It is worth them characterizing poverty in late antique Rome, the second part of this talk. So let me make clear that I'm not interested in the old debate about decline or transformation that attracts so many late antique scholars. Rome experienced profound changes during the long period between 300 and 600. It was certainly a poorer city, but so was the world around it. Crucially, we don't know how wealth was distributed. We just don't know. We don't know whether the smaller, less populated, and poorer city of Gregory the Great was more unequal than the 4th century metropolis of Symmachus, with its senators owning land all over the Mediterranean. And this is an important but unresolved question for our understanding of poverty. What we do know is that Rome was more exposed to poverty drivers than it had been at the time of Trajan, due to its very historical context. The political fragmentation of the West, the disruption of trade networks, the settlement of new populations, the start of the so-called late antique Ice Age are some of the issues that contributed to this new scenario. I listed some of the poverty drivers we can identify in our sources, just to give an idea of the challenges faced by the Roman population. And I would like to explore them very briefly before we discuss strategies of survival. So there has been enormous progress in recent scholarship on death and disease in the late Roman world, and their impact on social conditions. Rome's mortality regime also played an important role in making life harder for late antique people. Ancient cities were like death traps, ridden with diseases. Karl Harper recently re-examined the Christian epitaphs of Rome, trying to understand the seasonal character of mortality rates between 300 and 600. These epitaphs often record the date of death of the people being celebrated, and it is possible to see how these are distributed over the course of a calendar year. As you can see on the chart, mortality reached a peak from the end of summer to the middle of autumn for different age groups. This suggests that a lot of these people, including many young ones, were dying of diseases like intestinal infections and malaria, a reality that affected the poor harder than anyone else. Now, why is this important for our study of poverty? Now, we know that disease and death are a powerful factor in making families experience hardship, as a relative of working age was suddenly taken away. More importantly, studies of ancient demography talk of fatherless families. This is a result of the fact that men married later in life than women, and death came quite early in general. Walter Scheidel recently suggested that approximately 30% of all men lost their fathers before reaching adulthood, which gives an idea of how important this element was. References to the book of Job, like the one by Ambrose, in the writings of clerics were common at this time. Hunger can also be seen as a structural element in our list of poverty drivers. Lelia Cracco-Ruggini listed 33 crises of supply in Italy from the beginning of the 4th to the middle of the 5th century. And these are the documented ones. So 33 for more or less 150 years. This is a remarkable number when we consider that during this period, emperors and secular authorities continued to invest huge resources in the preservation of public warehouses and on the service of the annona, the imperial system of food distribution to Roman citizens. So even having emperors and the imperial structure in place, you still have all this crisis of supply. The impact of this driver became clearer from the 5th century onwards, as there were more reasons for disruption when the structures of imperial government collapsed in the West. Writing at the end of our period, Bishop Gregory the Great recorded an instructive case, and I quote, "Some nuns have come to this city from various provinces, fleeing after being captured, and several of them were placed in monasteries, as far as the possibility of the places allowed. But those among them who could not be housed at all are living singularly destitute lives of poverty. Because of this, it has been decided that what could be spared from the blind and maimed and other invalids ought to be paid to them, provided that not only indigent locals, but also strangers arriving here should receive the mercy of our Lordship." It's a society that is under tremendous pressure. Hunger never came alone. That's another problem. And we can use it as a way of illustrating the impact of death and war. The passages on the slide are here just to show how hunger and these other poverty drivers can be related. Ambrose tells a story in the Nabutai, and this is clearly a rhetorical, a literary device. I'm not claiming that this is what's happening, but it's illustrating the possibilities faced by these people. It tells the story of a father who, because of hunger, contracts debts. He cannot pay for his debts, and he's forced to sell his son. It's a wonderful or a bleak illustration of how these different poverty drivers come together. The second passage comes from Procopius's Wars, where he's talking about Rome under siege, and he's talking about how the citizens of Rome are exploited by the very soldiers who are here to protect them, who go out at night, collect the field from the grains, harvest the field from the grains, harvest the grains from the fields, bring the grains to Rome and sell them at a huge profit. War, disease, hunger, they come together. Some people make money out of it, like the soldiers of the Justinianic army, of the Byzantine army. Some people suffer from it. As excavations in different areas of Rome show, from the Crypta Balbi to the Palatine, imported foodstuffs continued to find their way to Rome until the end of our period and beyond, and the city remained an important economic center throughout the Middle Ages. At the same time, more limited access to vital areas of the Mediterranean, combined with military and political troubles in the 5th and 6th centuries, created more possibilities for disruption. It is not so much that there wasn't food all the time, but rather that access to it was limited or simply denied at critical moments. What Romans experienced was what Amartya Sen calls a crisis of entitlement. Now that we have explored our 4 poverty drivers, it is worth pausing to take stock of their importance in late antique society. Most of the drivers I have singled out were present in classical or archaic times too. Roman peasants also had issues with bad harvests or harsh mortality regimes in the Republican and early imperial period, for example. Wars were not a new element in the history of the Mediterranean. The point that interests me here is that between the age of Constantine and the time of Gregory the Great, these poverty drivers entered a new phase in their history, and their impact was felt in very different ways. It is as if the horsemen of the apocalypse of Jura were replaced by the horsemen of Neil Gaiman's and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens, if you want. So it's a new version. The processes, the drivers are still the same, but they happen with a different intensity, and they're felt in different ways. The question we need to consider then is, what were the strategies adopted to survive in this new environment? So this leads me to the third part of my talk, which is where I wanted to arrive, where I want to discuss in more detail the issues with which I started in the first place. There has been much work recently on the development of Christian charity and on the importance of bishops in taking care of the poor. However, rather than focusing on these elites and their initiatives, I will look more broadly at how people experiencing poverty dealt with it. I'm not going to get rid of the elites. They're still an important part of the picture. We cannot understand poverty without them, but I want to put the emphasis elsewhere. The first element I put there, I put it in the first place because I'm not really going to discuss it. Resistance and rebellion were fundamental, very important in late antique Rome. There has been fantastic recent work on the issue of urban riots, urban rebellions, movement by the crowds. I myself have written a little bit about it. I will refer to it at the very end, but I think it's better to explore issues that haven't been so explored by this bibliography focused on subaltern history. I need to be mindful of the little time we have. Here, I will focus on the issues of labor, patronage and protection, and especially begging as a way of finding agency among the humbler parts of Roman society. Labor is certainly the easiest one to discuss here. Fabrizio Visconti collected the iconographic and epigraphic evidence for the presence of workers in the catacombs of Rome, and he showed not only a large number of professions celebrated in these individual monuments, but also the importance that labor had for these people, shaping their very identity. The building of the Aurelian Wall in the late 3rd and its extensive renovation in the early 5th century must have generated a huge amount of work for the people of Rome, even if soldiers might have been extensively employed at places. Demolition or spoliation works also became more important as the centuries passed, also requiring specialized and coordinated teams of workers. There's no shortage of opportunities for people to find work in Rome. Workers organized in guilds established strong links with powerful aristocrats, such as the Guild of the Pork Dealers, the Suari, with Proculus, is the inscription you see on the top right. Below it, you see the base of the statue dedicated by the grain measurers of Portus, the mensores, to the prefect of the Annona, Dragonius Vincentius Celsus. Work allowed them to create social bonds with powerful patrons, who often intervened requesting privileges from the court, with their bosses who pay their wages, as well as with their colleagues, leading to beautiful spaces like the cubiculum in the catacombs of Domitilla that you see in the center, celebrating leaders of the bread-making establishment. So work was a fundamental aspect of the life of late antique Romans. Bread making, especially. Bread making was, in fact, an important activity in late antique Rome. From the 3rd century onwards, Romans had stopped receiving grain through the Annona and started receiving bread instead. It was crucial for the system to work, to have a network of bakeries or pistrina in all the regions of the city. The regionary catalogs, with which you're probably familiar by now, record a number of these establishments for all 14 regions of Rome, ranging from 15 to 25. It's always amusing to count it and see that the figures they give at the summaries don't really match the figures they give for each region, but that's just part of the game. It is a fine network indeed. We don't know whether they are referring exclusively to larger establishments working for the annona under contract, or also to the smaller private bakeries serving the local markets. What we can imagine is that this number changed over time, as some pistrina went out of use and others were created. It was recently suggested that the oven installed in the structure behind the Crypta Balbi was a small bakery datable to the 6th century, for example. Being paid to work is certainly a form of income, but we need to be careful with how we interpret these installations and their contribution to the overall prosperity of the Roman people. The historian Socrates of Constantinople records the case of a soldier who was in Rome during the visit of Theodosius I in 389, fell into a trap when visiting a bar, and was enslaved and forced to work in a pistrinum. Apuleius of Madaura famously described in his The Golden Ass the harsh conditions of work in these facilities, describing the constant beatings and degrading conditions faced by these men and animals in his case. So we have to be careful when we equate, work is a strategy, is a social strategy for dealing with poverty, but not exactly in the sense that you're paid a wage and by saving it, you can buy a house and pay for your kids to go to university. That's not the point here. You get more than that, but you also get less than that. And there is a lot going on in terms of work in late antique Rome, as we're now discovering. In 2014, a conference dedicated to the archaeology of production from the 5th to the 15th century, organized in Rome, revealed an impressive number of finds of workshops dedicated to metalworking, bread making, the spoliation of marble, and many more activities, showing how dynamic was the Roman economy during this period. We also see new agents in place and new projects. The workers employed by bishops like Sixtus III, who built Santa Maria Maggiore, and by Simplicius at Santo Stefano Rotondo, benefited from the growing economic power of the church. Now, as this discussion makes clear, talking about work involves also talking about patronage and dependence, which was another way of facing the challenges posed by poverty drivers, bringing opportunities and support in moments of need. We just saw in the case of the Roman guilds how patrons exercised an important role in protecting the interests of their clients. There are lots of patrons in late antique Rome. The imperial government was also involved in these transactions, and I wanted to emphasize this because we tend to exclude the presence of the government as a patron. We know this from the creation of institutions like the Alimenta schemes, which became common in Italy in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, so that's not about Rome exactly. But we know that Constantine in the 4th century instituted new schemes to support parents who could not feed their children, and emperors made special grants at times of need. It was their duty as universal patrons. Even an emperor who never set foot in Rome, like Justin II, who ruled from Constantinople from 565 to 578, also supported the people of Rome, as we see in the passage on the slide. We know of Justin's initiative because of the biography of Pope Benedict I in the Liber Pontificalis, and this is not by chance. If there is any guiding line for the history of patronage in late antique Rome, is the growing role played by bishops. Popes played an important role as intermediary in receiving donations from aristocrats in Rome and from places as distant as Constantinople and Carthage. The dialogues of Gregory the Great record stories that show peasants and other poor people coming to monasteries looking for food and help, showing how Romans in need were aware of the possibilities offered by the development of new religious institutions and the way they occupied urban space. We're remarkably poor informed about the presence of monasteries in the late antique cityscape, but we do have more reliable information about the early Middle Ages, and that gives a sense of how important these structures became between the 4th and the end of the 6th century. You can see the map on the left there. Oops. This support was offered not only in terms of material resources, but also work. Gregory mentioned twice in his homilies on the Gospels the story of this very good monk, ideal monk, very devout Christian, who joins the monastery and is a very esteemed member of the community, but his brother also joins the community, and his brother is a lousy monk who doesn't believe in any of that, apparently, doesn't help the others, doesn't like working. And Gregory says the only reason why he doesn't leave the monastery is because he cannot afford to live outside the monastery. So that gives us a sense, it's a funny anecdote, but it also gives a sense of the role that these institutions are playing in late antique Rome. Aristocrats were also aware of the possibilities offered by Christian institutions. And Jerome tells us of hospitals and hostelries, or xenodochia, for travelers and for the poor, founded by Christian nobles who competed in establishing their sainted credentials. Now, this is something, I'm not going to go into this, but it's something that seems to be going on a lot. Sorry, I shouldn't have gone there. Here. Now, one point that really interests me is something that is raised in an oration 47 of Libanius from Antioch. It was written around 390. And in this oration, Libanius is complaining that the peasants from the Syrian villages around Antioch are not paying their homage. They're not following their traditional patrons, that is, the landowners from Antioch who own land in the surrounding fields. Instead, they're seeking the protection of military leaders who are establishing themselves in that area. Libanius is reminding us that poor people, they suffer very harsh conditions, but whenever they have the opportunity, they try to make the most of it. In the case of the inhabitants of the countryside around Antioch, they're playing the system. They're abandoning certain patrons and they're looking for others. This abundance of patrons around Rome, aristocrats, bishops, clerics, emperors, made this also a possibility, and we should not rule this out of hand. This brings me to the last strategy I want to discuss here. Begging is, by definition, the ultimate form of subjection, the last option available to the poor. In this sense, it is not worth considering it as a form of strategy. Rome was full of beggars, as we know. People without hope, the elderly, the sick, the orphans, the fragile. Or as Jerome writes in a letter, that blind man holding out his hand and often crying out when there is no one to hear is the heir of Paulina, the co-heir with Pamachius. That dismembered man who drags himself has his hand supported by a delicate girl. One with a swollen belly awaits death. Another, speechless and mute, and without the means of begging, begs the more appealingly because he cannot beg. Another, maimed since he was a child, begs not for himself. That man has his limbs rotted with jaundice and survives after his body has become a corpse. If I had 100 tongues and 100 mouths, I would not be able to tell all of men's punishments. Unfortunately, that reference to Virgil's Aeneid gives away the literary character of Jerome's letter, but I think it's still interesting how he's able to enumerate all these different types of ailments and all these types of beggars that can be found in the street. Even in this highly charged context, our evidence suggests that the humblest of the poor could find ways of maximizing their returns precisely by playing up their situation. Now, I want to make it very clear, begging is not a good thing, and I don't think anyone had this as a career goal in late antique Rome or any time. But it's interesting to see, or it's interesting to think about the possibility of people trying to maximize begging as a social strategy when that is what was left to them. This is clearly what is appearing in this imperial law that you see on the slide, where the imperial authorities write to the prefect of Rome in 382 this. If there should be any persons who adopt the profession of mendicancy and who are induced to seek their livelihood at public expense, each of them shall be examined. The soundness of body and the vigor of ears of each one of them shall be investigated. In the case of those who are lazy and not to be pitied on account of any physical disability, the necessity shall be placed upon them that the zealous and diligent informer shall obtain the ownership of those beggars who are held bound by their servile status. The quaestor who wrote this letter certainly now writes for the Daily Mail, as you can see. The law focuses on those who are able to work and yet choose to beg. Now, there is an impossible thing here being said. Examine everybody. We know that that's just beyond the means of the late Roman state. But the idea is that you have informers who will denounce the beggars that they encounter. You look too healthy, or you look like you could be working, this kind of stuff. Now, even more remarkably, the law mentions people of servile status who are caught begging. Now, that's really problematic. What does that mean? Were they begging without the knowledge of their owners? Or were they begging sent by their owners? We simply don't know, but it looks like begging is something that was on the cards if you were running out of options. This was a real concern of the authorities, and it's demonstrated also by a passage in Ambrosius Diophyces, written more or less at the same time. There are people who come along, people who are in perfectly good health, and they come along with no good reason other than the fact that they spend their lives wandering from place to place, and their intention is to use up the supplies intended for the poor and to reduce to nothing the resources that have been collected for them. Now, we have to be very careful here and not accept the idea that all beggars, or not even most of the beggars, are lazy schemers, as what's coming across from these texts. I think what we need to remember is that church authorities, imperial authorities, they're under a very hard in a very hard position. They have to manage limited resources at a time where there is growing pressure on these resources. And looking for people gaming the system is one way of trying to reduce that pressure. It seems clear also that begging could generate different responses. Ambrose emphasizes in different passages of his treatise that almsgivers should be wary of giving too much, not to those who needed most, but to those who cried louder or more repeatedly. And this is something that appears in a number of sermons and a number of treatises. In Antioch, John Chrysostom talks about the same. He talks about beggars who draw nails through their heads, or who cut their arms or blind their children as a way of generating pity and being more successful in begging. Now, I'm pretty sure there's an awful lot of literary exaggeration there, but I think the idea that, and I think Ambrose with his more circumspect language is closer to the truth, the idea that beggars who cry louder are more efficient in securing resources than the beggars who are suffering quietly. There is something to that. Some of the complexities of this issue appear in this letter of Jerome, which is a fantastic letter. It's very well known to scholars of late antiquity, but it's worth quoting for people who are not really into reading the correspondence of St. Jerome, which I don't recommend. He says, recently I saw the most prominent lady in Rome. I do not mention her name, lest you think I'm writing satire, in St. Peter's Basilica, attended by her eunuchs. She was dispensing charity to the beggars, giving them a penny apiece. Meanwhile, as might easily have been expected, a certain old woman, conspicuous for her ears and her rags, ran to the head of the line to get another penny. When she had reached the lady in due course, she received instead of the coin a blow with the fist. She was guilty of so great an offense that her blood was shed. Now, we do not need to believe that this event actually happened to appreciate the importance of this passage for understanding begging as a social strategy. The cunning of the beggar, the behavior of the Christian lady, who is clearly very ostentatious for Jerome's liking, these are elements that have echoes in many other texts. Beggars could maximize their rewards through cunning and insistence, but they could also do it through merit, leading a holy life or displaying signs of their diseases and disabilities. Gregory the Great tells us of a beggar called Serus, who could be seen by his listeners in the porch leading to San Clemente. I apologize, but I had to put it there. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's such a great passage, and I had to just share it with you. It's basically telling of this. I'm sorry, I'm going to read. In the porch through which we passed to enter the church of Blessed Clement, there was a certain person named Serus. Many of you knew him as well as I. He was poor in possessions, but rich in merits. A long illness had incapacitated him. From his youth right up to the end of his life, he lay paralyzed. Why should I say that he was unable to stand when he could never raise himself up in his bed, even to a sitting position? He could never bring his hand to his mouth, never turn himself onto his other side. His mother and brother were there to wait on him, and whatever he had been able to get as an alms, he bestowed by their hands on the poor. He did not know how to read, but he had bought for himself manuscripts of the Holy Scriptures, and he had all the religiously minded persons who were friendly toward him read this to him without interruption. And then he goes on. Now, this is a very suspicious passage. I mean, the name Servus is already a bit of a giveaway. The fact that his existence is construed in such a holy model is also makes me wary of accepting this text at face value. Well, we do have here some of the elite expectations of what a deserving beggar would be, both unable to work and holy. And this is already something that makes this text interesting for us. But what I'm really interested in is in the agency of Servus and the network of solidarity formed around him. He's an impresario of the poor, using his extra revenue that comes from his holiness and his physical condition to help other beggars. He's even able to invest in what makes his begging efficient. He purchases the scriptures, and that increases his standing and makes his begging more efficient. His mother and his brother, the people who read the Bible, he has a network of supporters around him. This is interesting to me because ethnographic studies of begging in places like Rio de Janeiro, Kinshasa, and Delhi highlight the capacity of beggars to establish informal associations based on family bonds as well as physical proximity with their own hierarchies, limited forms of solidarity. We cannot dismiss this possibility in the case of Rome. And this is actually suggested by the sources, even earlier sources. Juvenal, for example, observed that Jewish beggars congregated near Porta Capena. Martial complained that Jewish kids were taught to beg by their mothers. Now, there is for sure an enormous deal of anti-Semitism and prejudice against beggars in these texts. But I think this suggests that even the most unpleasant Romans could see that there was more to begging than an individual submission. There was the possibility of creating a socially shared strategy for approaching poverty. I promise I am coming to an end. Gregory and his beggars offer me the opportunity to conclude this talk, exploring the ways in which the poverty dynamics and the strategies of survival we have been discussing helped to create a distinctive late antique urban space. What I want to know is to what extent the way space was organized and conceptualized in late antique Rome was influenced by the dynamics we have explored so far. We will continue with Gregory's homilies on the Gospels, this time a homily read on the 22nd of May, 593, in the Basilica of San Lorenzo on the Via Tiburtina. It's a lovely homily where Gregory draws out implications from a passage of the Gospel of Luke, the parable of Lazarus. I'm not going to assume that you have this in your mind. It's a passage that starts with, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores." Now you can imagine what Gregory does with this. You know, he draws out the implications of the inequalities that you see in Rome. The rich people in their houses and the poor begging outside. I mean, there's plenty of anti-Semitism here too, in the way that late antique preachers present it. He says that the rich man is the Jew, the beggar is the Gentile, and the dogs licking his wounds are the priests, right? But after this religious interpretation, he goes on a very, very sharp criticism of the inequalities in Roman society. The greed and the avarice of the rich living in splendor in their grand houses in contrast with the suffering of the poor that lived at the entrance of these houses. And this is a topic that appears in other Christian writers, like Jerome, for example. What these authors also reveal is how in late antique Rome, the large aristocratic domus that since the 4th century had taken over entire neighborhoods were particularly able to attract the poor and therefore start to change the social topography of the city. Robert Coate Stephens reminded us a few weeks ago that the houses of the Roman elite were centers of power and social life in their own right. And he was talking about an earlier period, but this is valid for the 4th century. We tend to see these houses in isolation, as they survive in the form of churches like Santa Balbina on the Aventine, for example. Aristocrats invested in the elaborate architecture of dining halls and reception rooms, building fountains and magnificent courtyards, like in the case of the domus built on top of the Sette Sale, which you see on the right. This is where the rich dined and entertained their friends, while, and I quote Jerome, naked before their doors, Christ lay dying. But we must remember that these houses were organically integrated with the space and social life around them, as the excavation of an entire neighborhood near Termini reminds us, as the image you see on the left. It was natural in the sense that not only senatorial friends, relatives, and clients were drawn to these spaces, but the beggars who could benefit from leftovers too. This is acknowledged in sources like the Acts of Martyrs, where Christians are shown hiding in the houses of their patrons, and where pious converts shelter the sick and the destitute. What we need to remember then is that the houses of the super rich were key points in late antique Rome's topography of poverty. Rather than detracting from it, the presence of the poor in front of the door confirmed the prestige and wealth of members of the Roman elite. This was true for secular aristocrats, but particularly true for Rome's clergy. Just as with houses, we tend to overlook the importance of the poor when we talk of the Christianization of Rome's topography, debating the location of churches or who their patrons were. But Roman bishops knew better. We find an elaborate narrative in the Liber Pontificalis of how successive popes developed a system to help the poor and the needy, a system centered on their parish churches. It doesn't really matter whether this narrative is full of inconsistencies and tends to project to the past things that we know only happened later. The fact is, the writers, the compilers of the Liber Pontificalis, who are working in the middle of the 6th century, are keen in inscribing this concern, this connection between churches and the poor of Rome in the history of their institution. It was in these churches that the poor were identified, registered, and assisted with donations. Bishop Leo the Great, in the middle of the 5th century, gave a series of sermons on the collections in which he admonished his listeners to give to the poor. But he didn't tell them to just go and give to the poor. He tells them to bring their donations to the church, and the church will handle it, because it is the church who knows who the poor are, who the needy are, because the church has this capillary spread around Rome with all the parish churches, all the titular churches, and it's through this network that they can do it, therefore attracting the poor to the church. Churches are usually represented in this text as full of people, full of poor people. It is a conscious strategy of attracting those in need to these spaces. We must remember that these clerics, they actually do believe in this. It's not just a social and political strategy. It's a spiritual imperative to bring the poor and look after the poor. And having more poor around your church is a way of showing that you're doing a good job before God. The lady who punched the beggar in the story narrated by Jerome did it in the Basilica of St. Peter, of all places. Paulinus of Nola tells us that the aristocrat Pamachius celebrated the funeral of his wife by offering a banquet to the destitute of Rome in the atrium of the St. Vatican Basilica. That is, even aristocrats know that that's where you need to go if you want to see or to help the poor. A very interesting story is recorded by the historian Priscus. He says that during the civil conflict in which the imperial troops of Anthemius confronted and were defeated by the also imperial troops of his general Ricimer in 472, the emperor tried to hide by disguising himself as a beggar and mingling with the beggars living near San Crisogro in Trastevere. That didn't work. He was discovered. But the fact that, according to Zosimus, an emperor might conceive this plan, this crazy plan of disguising himself as a poor man and going to hang out in front of a church and escape unnoticed, that is very, very interesting. And it reveals a lot about how Romans conceived these spaces and the presence of the poor there. We need to put the common people back into our picture of the late antique city. As I mentioned earlier, there has been exceptional work dedicated to finding and analyzing productive spaces in late antique and early medieval Rome. As scholars have shown, this was not relegated to the outskirts or less densely populated areas, but often occupied important spaces in the center of the city. Caro Fulvio Giuliani and Patrizia Verducci identified workshops dedicated to metalworking and the spoliation and processing of marble in the central area of the Roman Forum. They also noticed traces of later use of at least one of the honorific columns that closed the western side of the square, with fittings for wooden structures, possibly related to shops or workshops. More recently, a small metalworking establishment was identified in one of the tabernae of the Forum of Caesar, smelting bronze, probably recovered through the systematic spoliation of the monuments of the area. This is datable to the 5th century, which means it was in use at the same time as senators and imperial officials frequented the area. In other words, these were not secret or illegal initiatives, but carried out in the open, obviously with the knowledge of the authorities. Giuliani and Verducci suggested that these were state-led operations, but I find more likely that these productive units were owned by aristocrats with friends in high places, possibly providing material for public works. It is not my intention here to present an overview of all these facilities. In the case of metalworking, which is interesting me here, I owe a great deal to Julia Bison's useful article just published in Antiquity Tardive, and I recommend you read it. It was her work that drew my attention to this fascinating work being done in the area of Santo Mobono. This is an area very near the port of Rome, full of temples, public facilities, and apartment blocks. Here, Monica Cecchi recently identified a group of furnaces used for metalworking in a lime kiln in the vicinity of the temple, and one in the structure known as the Insula Volusiana. I have marked them in red there. The very size and roughness of these workshops suggests that they were not large-scale operations. They were not state-owned. But it's still interesting that there are so many of them close to each other. And I think this also suggests that there is someone who is on top of this, who is leading this initiative of converting this area for productive activities. That these productive areas were frequented by all sorts of people seems a very logical assumption to me. We should remember that this was a busy part of late antique Rome across our period, and that right to the north of these furnaces was the Vicus Iugarius, marked there with the green arrow, the old street that connected the river to the Roman Forum. It was in this area that Gregory, the bishop, years before becoming bishop, saw a group of young boys from Britain being sold as slaves, fair like angels, which inspired him years later to send a mission to convert the island. These were spaces that most likely were controlled by the elites, however. And I would like to end by quickly considering other types of spaces and other types of use where poverty was more challenging to the governing classes. Now, we do have many references in texts to beggars gathering in streets, especially crossroads, as well as on the roads leading to Rome. I think it is harder to control the poor in these areas. The Acts of Santa Cecilia mention Christians helping the poor gathered on the Via Appia. And a famous passage of Ammianus Marcellinus says that the then praetor Volusianus distributed money to the poor in the Vatican, probably on the Via Aurelia, instead of giving it to the populace in the circus out of spite. So he knew where to go. Gregory says that Servilus occupied the porch leading to San Clemente, possibly living there. All over the Mediterranean, archaeologists find traces of adaptation and partitioning of porticos along important roads. And it shouldn't surprise us if at least some in Rome were used as shelter. Juvenal and Seneca remind us that all the beggars needed to sleep was a mat, often with their colleagues. I recently became interested in the building of tuguria, or dwellings or huts in late antique Rome. This came from this law from 399 in the Theodosian Code, where the emperor complains of the presence of these tuguria in the campus marshes. I have just explored this in more detail. I'm not going to go into detail there, but this just to show you that there are these precarious, impermanent, or temporary dwellings occupying different parts of the city. And even imperial legislators are concerned with this. And we're talking about the campus marshes, and they're crowded with imperial monuments. But perhaps the most eloquent example of how popular groups could subvert and give meaning to the grand spaces of the city is the area around the Circus Maximus, the heart of Rome and the Romans, if we believe Ammianus Marcellinus. He tells us in a passage where he reviews all his scorn for the lower classes of Rome, of the love of common Romans for chariot races. And this is what he says. But of the multitude of lowest condition and greatest poverty, some spend the entire night in wine shops. Some lurk in the shade of the awnings of the theaters, or they quarrel with one another in the games at dice. Or, which is the favorite of their amusements, from sunrise until evening, in sunshine and in rain, they stand open-mouthed, examining minutely the good points or the defects of charioteers and their horses. And it is most remarkable to see an innumerable crowd of plebeians, their minds filled with a kind of eagerness, hanging on the outcome of the chariot races. Anyone who has walked around the Stadio Olimpico when Rome and Lazio are playing has seen something like this. Note that here, Ammianus is not really talking of the supporters cheering inside the circus, but about those who didn't get in. Not all Romans were entitled to attend circus races, and even those who were entitled, among those who were entitled, not all of them managed to get inside the circus every day there was a race. There were people who hung outside the circus, who listened to and discussed the news and results about their favorite sport and their heroes, while on the streets, tabernae, bars, warehouses, and other establishments that still crowd the slope of the Palatine towards the Circus Maximus. This was an area where ideas were exchanged, gossip circulated, where fights and arguments were started. In other words, a space for creating social solidarity. Not far from it, we know, the Emperor Septimius Severus built the Septisodium in the beginning of the 3rd century. An elaborate structure decorated with columns of colored marble and a series of niches, maybe housing statues. The inscription copied around the end of the 8th century emphasizes the imperial and dynastic character of the monument, associating Severus, the founder of a new dynasty, to the family of the Antonine emperors that preceded him, with all their titles. In the late 4th century, the biography of Severus in the Historia Augusta observed that, and I quote, when he built the Septisonium, he had no other thought than that his building should strike the eyes of those who came to Rome from Africa. Now, the emphasis there is on imperial splendor, but also on the people, travelers arriving, and the frequentation of this space. This was a clear celebratory monument in an area that marked Rome as an imperial city, an area frequented by Romans of all classes, especially, that is, by those most passionate about the circus that so upset Ammianus. It is not surprising that in 355, it was at this precise spot that the urban prefect Leontius had to confront an angry crowd rioting because of the scarcity of wine in the city. Conceived to celebrate a new ruling dynasty, the Septisonium could be turned into a space for social interaction and protest, where Roman citizens and their poorer neighbors demonstrated and challenged the authorities celebrated in the monuments that still dominate our imagination and our bibliographies. To conclude, as I hope to have shown, there is much for us to gain by looking at poverty in the context of late antique Rome. Between 300 and 600, the inhabitants of the city saw new challenges as well as old challenges that assumed new aspects, which directly threatened their subsistence. They did not remain passive in this process, but rather looked for ways of coping with their difficulties, employing a variety of strategies that went from outright confrontation to deception, from loyalty to manipulation. In the process, they helped to redefine the social and political topography of the city. Often, as we saw, following the agendas and priorities of the rulers and patrons. But as the case of the Circus Maximus reminds us, sometimes they did it by subverting and openly challenging the authority of the elite. In this way, they played a key role in the making of late antique Rome. Thank you. Thank you.
Well deserved.
Thank you.
Absolutely well deserved. I have a huge amount of questions, but before asking mine, I would like to open the mic for the audience and even the online audience in case there's anyone wishing to open the debate. Otherwise, I'll be asking the first question. Eccole. Okay, I think I can start. I would like to start from the passage you quoted from the Codex Theodosianus that was mentioning how much the so-called fake beggars could be a problem for the state treasury, as they were pretending to be poor, but in fact they were not. Why does it have to be a problem for the imperial treasury? I mean, does it mean that there was a bureau in charge of taking care of an officially appointed bureau? And on the other hand, why does it concern Theodosius when even private institutions or the church itself could well take care of even people who are not properly poor?
Thank you. Okay, yeah, that's a great question because there's something to clarify. There isn't any evidence for the imperial authorities actually looking after the very poor of Rome. And we know that the Annona system, for example, only really supported citizens and those who were entitled to it. Not all citizens were entitled to the distribution of the Annona, right? I think there the imperial authorities are concerned with, let's say, the public good. So people spending money on that, rather than being it's our treasury that is suffering with it.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
Thanks, Carlos. I have a question about something that you alluded to a bit, and also the pictures also make me think of this a bit, which is the relationship between poverty and work and poverty and labor. I mean, the images that you showed, for the most part, are scenes of labor, and you've presented them in the context of a talk about poverty. And so your literary sources and some of these things that you're talking about now encourage us to see poverty in certain ways. And I appreciate what you've also said about poverty as being something that's transitory in ways that work and poverty can relate to each other, but also in which other things in poverty, you know, including inheritances and people who live off of rents can go into, fall into states of poverty. So I guess maybe if you could say a little bit more about that, and then also what happened, where and what happens when you do see scenes depicted of of destitution? Are there ways of seeing that as well? And just to say a little more about the visual element of that and what makes you feel we're looking at something to represent poverty versus just labor, and what the difference between those.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful, Arent, because that's something I decided to cut because it was too long already, but it's really important. So just to answer your second question first, because it's the easiest one, I don't know off the top of my head visual representations of destitution from Rome in this period. I can think of easily about later, especially Byzantine representations of destitution coming in religious imagery, icons, for example. But there might be something I can't remember right now. So it's about labor, really. I think there are different things I wanted to do there, and trying to cover so much I can't really do. One is to disconnect labor from, an efficient way, or a way that is sure to get you out of poverty, right? What we see in these sources, and this appears in a number of sources, is that labor is often associated with exploitation. Actually, the sources tend to emphasize that much more. At the same time, we do know that labor is an important aspect of the life of the populations of the population of Rome. I mean, there is a lot of work on, for example, on the cantieri medievali, the working teams who build or who remove bricks from the baths of Caracalla, or who build the baths of Caracalla, or who build this or build that. So there is a lot of work being done about that, and that gives us a lot of insight about how work was organized in Rome and what an important aspect of life it was. So it's, I don't want at this stage to rule labor out as one strategy of getting out of poverty, because if you're not getting some wage out of it, at least you're getting the social interactions that come with labor. But at the same time, I don't want to misrepresent labor as saying that labor will save you and make you rich. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. Yeah.
I guess people could also be paid in kind, maybe not necessarily with a wage, but with food.
Yes.
Basic staple.
Yes, definitely. Yes. So, sorry, instead of wage, income is a better way of saying it, right? So there are different ways of getting that. One thing that is very clear is that it is important and that they understand that. So you do have, for example, in the, there is a letter of Gregory the Great where he talks about, I think it's a church in Formia that is destroyed by the Lombards, and it says that the bishop decided to rebuild the church. And he says that that's also a way of helping the workers. There's one of the documents that I cut out because I had too many texts, but it's fascinating because the workers then rebel because the bishop doesn't have the money to pay them. So you have all this kind of stuff going on. Naples also has a similar case in one of the letters of Gregory. So it is happening there.
Thank you, Carlos. It was really interesting. Could I push you a bit more on how you define poverty? In that you said at the beginning, obviously, you're not going with modern ideas of it's £1.20 or $1.20 a day. But something that I think it comes out from the sources rather from yourself, you're left with this dichotomy of rich and poor and have nots. But there is a point where you've got something and that doesn't make you poor. So is there anything in your research you've come across that you're poor if you haven't got this and you're rich if you have got this? I mean, if someone's living in the doorway, it's easy enough to categorize them as living in poverty. If someone's living on the top floor of an insular block, are they poor? And then likewise, are you using definitions of people acting outside of social norms to define them as poor? So the act of begging, or perhaps the act of being forcibly unemployed or something like that. So could you just say more about how you're to get away perhaps from the clear, these people are rich, these people are poor, and what about the euphemistic squeezed middle or something?
Okay, thank you. Are you ready for another 50 minutes? No, that's a great question, Chris. Thank you. It's a problem that exists in modern definitions in poverty studies. So so you have these objective definitions that try to establish an income level below which you're poor. And it's a very sophisticated calculation, and they take into account the value of currency in a given country. It's very complicated, very sophisticated, and it's very useful. But this is a problem that has plagued studies of poverty, not just studies of poverty. Adam Smith himself, he says that someone will be poor in France. Sorry, someone who can't wear, I can't remember now the exact quote, because I'm always repeating this to my students, someone who doesn't have a decent pair of shoes is poor in Britain, but is not poor in France, something like that. And which maybe reveals more about Adam Smith's conceptions about Europe than about poverty. But there is a difficulty there. I really like the definition of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and they talk about poverty as being the lack of means, and they put in brackets, mainly material means, to ensure participation in society. But this is very vague. So it's one of the problems I find with studies of poverty is that economists are looking at a very hard definition that clearly is not solving the problem. And sociologists and social workers are using a definition that makes it very hard to define the poor. What I like about this ambiguity is that we see exactly this in the texts. So for example, there is a beautiful study by Christophe Hreux of the poor in legal papyri in Egypt. And what you see is that people, it's the standard way of approaching the judge is by saying that you're poor, even if you're not poor. Okay, so let's say it's a label that is convenient, but there are reasons you need to justify why you are allowed to use that label. So there is this ambiguity in the concept, this ambiguity in the sources that I find very interesting. That's why I am focusing on the processes, on the poverty drivers, on the strategies to deal with them, because I can consider the information that these texts offer. I can consider the case of Philemouth, who is blind and lost all the resources, but it's son of a nobleman, or at least a very worthy man, without worrying whether he's poor or not, because he's being impacted by poverty drivers. And I think that's one way of returning to this question of who is poor and who is rich, but without getting too tangled up in numbers or in the meaning of words, if that makes sense.
There are 8 online questions. Maybe we can, do you think we can combine the first 2 of them? There is a question asking if the success of the church between the 4th and the 6th century AD is the result of the number of poor and their despair in the empire. And as a sort of connection to this question, there also is one asking who was funding the church at that time.
Thank you. So to the first question, no, I'm not saying that. I don't know why the church succeeded. I'm not a believer, so it didn't work with me. But it's not because of the number of poor and the despair in the empire. That would be a very functionalist answer to give. No, it's more to do with their ability to gather cultural, social resources to respond to the spiritual needs of that population. I think it's more because of that than because of just the number of the poor or the fact that the empire was going through a grim phase. About who was funding the church, I think that varies. That's a very difficult question because the church drew funding from lots of sources, from the properties it received from imperial sponsors, from aristocratic sponsors, money given by people like Melania, or properties given by some of people like Proba. So there are different sources of income, and then the church owning those properties, the church draws revenue from those resources. Now they have people working in the fields, they have houses being rented in Rome. So there is a number of sources of revenue for the church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have a quick question. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned a Procopius quote about like soldiers sneaking out of the fortifications to collect grain and sell at high prices. And this quote is evidently specific to the conditions of Rome under siege. So I was wondering, firstly, are there other strategies to survive poverty that's specific to or especially important in wartime? And secondly, can you discuss in more detail the economic structuring of the city after violent upheavals, which systematically affect many levels of society and reduce all of them to destitution?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the second part of the question.
Just like, could you discuss in more detail the restructuring economically of the city after violent upheavals, because this would affect all levels of society rather uniformly, unlike personal accidents and misfortunes.
All right, okay, thank you. So we do have a lot of evidence about moments of military crisis. A lot of especially Eastern historians like Sozomen or Zosimus and Procopius, they talk about when Rome is under siege. And it's a pretty grim picture they paint. So they do talk about, and this is something that comes up a lot in the narrative of Procopius about Rome during the Gothic War. He talks a lot about soldiers and even Bessas, the general, who are taken advantage. So for example, when a shipment of grain arrives, they keep that for themselves. They don't distribute it to the people. They sell it at a high price. So there are lots of references to that. There are a lot of references to, for example, the people of Rome resorting to cannibalism. It's very difficult to interpret these sources. Can we really accept this? I mean, there is a side of me that finds it very hard to believe that, like they say, mothers eating parts of their children. I find it very hard to think that that is not literary exaggeration, but on the other hand, they're all saying this. So I think it's more of an evidence of the despair and really the lack of options that these people are facing. Belisarius does have this idea of sending all the women and children away from Rome, and he sends them to Naples, leaving very few people in Rome as a way of trying to reduce this pressure on the food that is here. So, yeah, we do have a lot of information about what they do during sieges, but it's not tremendously reliable information. It's more information that illustrates the despairing conditions that Romans face, okay? Now, how Rome comes out of these crises, that is, I think there's more, there are others here in this room that are better prepared than me to answer that. It depends. So if we're dealing with the early 5th century after the Visigothic sack, right, it's not very clear how much damage the Visigothic sack caused, right? But if we're dealing with that period, we do have evidence for the urban prefect rebuilding structures in Rome. We do have information about, well, the prefect sending letters to the court asking for more resources for the Annona because the population is growing again. So we do see imperial authorities very much involved in that. We don't have so much evidence after 455. There's a little bit of epigraphic evidence, but it's not very clear to me. I'm afraid of answering and Sylvia correcting me very quickly. But I think what we see is that, and it never, it's difficult to talk about this. It never seems to return to what it was in the 4th century. That's something important to bear in mind. So we don't really have evidence for restorations of those, the big houses that are built in the 4th century. We don't really have good evidence for restorations in the second half of the 5th century. We actually have evidence for houses being abandoned in the second half of the 5th century. So it's clear that the society is still here. To use a term that is very in fashion nowadays, it's a resilient society. The elites are able to use the means they have to reestablish connections with different parts of the Mediterranean. They import wine from the east, from the Aegean. They import grain from Sicily. But it's difficult to pinpoint what are the strategies every time Rome goes for a crisis. What are the strategies to kind of make the city come back to life?
Abby.
Thank you. That was fascinating. This is a question from ignorance, but you talked very eloquently about the the downward pressures, the poverty drivers, but also the upward propulsion, the ways out. And I wondered how often in your sources you encounter success stories, but also whether there is in late antique society a suspicion about that process of escaping from poverty. I'm thinking of Dante's suspicion of subiti guadagni and the new money and the suspicion of old money, and whether escape from poverty is a problematic feature of the sources.
That is really interesting. The sources are full of references to social mobility upwards, but it's never from poverty. So Ammianus, for example, he complains of this man who, I can't remember his name now, but he worked for he worked in this, I think he was a pistor, I think he was a baker, and he becomes governor of the province of Tuscia et Umbria. And then he's executed because he's involved in corruption. And Gregory the Great talks of a priest that on his deathbed, it's in his dialogue. So it's, I wouldn't say it's the kind of the most reliable evidence for things happening, but it's a good guide for what people are thinking. He talks about this bishop that on his deathbed, he says, my successors will be, he says, a mule driver, and a fuller. And it's clear that he's not happy. He's not saying that as a good thing. He's saying, like, look, you're going to have this really dynamic entrepreneurial individuals coming to lead the community. He's saying, like, these really unworthy people coming on. So escaping from poverty. Yeah, I can't think of any example. And it's really—
That's very depressing. You need to find one.
I know, it's, I think because our sources, because of the nature of the sources, their sermons, their theological treatises, they're much more interested in things not working than things working. And that's very depressing. Yeah, I agree.
I think we can mix two more of the questions from the online audience. So Simon Malmberg is asking if the church made any effort to keep track of the poor. What evidence do we have for these efforts, and if they make poverty more visible in late antique Rome? And it would also be useful to discuss whether this approach was something novel, and if there are any precursors in the pagan institutions.
Right, okay.
There are 9 questions from the online audience, so I'm
Good.
just
Yes. No, thank you.
combining them together.
Right. In terms of precursors, so there are institutions like the Alimenta, for example, or the schemes that Constantine, there are 2 laws in the Theodosian Code addressed to officials in Italy, where he does talk about people being registered to receive help. And Constantine actually mentions that is a way of helping parents who can't support their children, and as a way of avoiding parasite. The alimenta aren't addressed to the extreme poor, but people who are facing hardship and tough times. So the alimenta is a scheme whereby you get a guaranteed loan at low interest rates, and it targets specific communities. Sometimes people with sons, sometimes people with sons or daughters, sometimes people with daughters. It varies. There's good epigraphic, but also the Historia Augusta is full of references to that. You do see references in writers like Seneca, for example, to the importance of almsgiving, and but it's not an institution that is related to that. Okay, so that's another thing. So I think the attitude of the church is novel in the sense of generalizing some attempts that are being done by the imperial authorities. Okay, and they take it to another level because it comes also with certain cultural baggage that comes from the ancient Near East through the Gospels. So the idea that you have to look after the poor. Oh, yes, how the church kept track. That's an excellent question, Simon. And It's something I explored a couple of years ago in a chapter called exactly Looking for the Poor in Late Antique Rome. And what I was interested in was the reference that you find in texts to ecclesiastical authorities, but also aristocrats and imperial authorities to count, register, and keep track of the poor. There's actually a lot of evidence. We don't have a clear reference to the matricula pauperum that we see, for example, in Egypt and later on in the West, in the late 5th, 6th centuries. But it's something that appears already in the 4th century. The very idea that appears in Ambrose, for example, when he talks about the need to go out and identify and know who the poor are, I think that's already pointing in that direction, that the church is trying to develop means of finding the poor and keeping track so that they can help these people, right?
Yes.
I know it's like a modern concept that sometimes in times when there's a low demand of labor, that the state will start some project simply to be able to give work to people who don't have any other. Were there ever any instances of either the imperial government or later by the churches where they started projects where part of the motivation was to supply labor or like to give people jobs?
Yes, there are. So Suetonius, for example, talks about, I think it's Vespasian, who decides not to invest in a new technology that would make building much easier and cheaper and faster, because building is a way of employing people. Suetonius also talks about Claudius building, well, draining the lake Fucino. How do you say that in English? The Fucino Lake. And he talks about how that took years and employed, I know, 30,000 people over 10 years. So I think there is a concern with that is happening. Now, for late antiquity, I can't remember of examples where that is actually spelled out, but the concern with jobs, with labor, is present in a number of laws where emperors are talking about regulating building activity. So I think it is present. I just can't remember specific examples. That is just because the last couple of days I had been looking at Suetonius and I could remember that. But I think the concern is clearly there. Now, there was another part of the question, or was that it?
Two more questions from our online audience about generally a connection between poverty and decline/decadence. Erin Limak is asking if there's a connection between poverty and crime, and Gul Shurmelinindi is asking about the connection between decline, increasing poverty, and parallels between Rome and Constantinople.
Okay.
Poverty, then decline.
Right. Okay. So about so that's one thing I definitely want to steer away from, is the idea that the fall of the Roman Empire led to a poorer, decadent society, right? But it does make sense that there are poverty drivers that are felt with more vigor in late antiquity. I mean, things do kind of turn in a different way. You have a state that is not as able to intervene, for example, building or restoring as it was before. The supply of Rome, for example, is heavily reliant on North Africa, is much more open to disruptions, and that impacts the life of people in the city. It's not just that you receive the annona. I mean, the annona didn't really contemplate all the population of Rome, but you imagine you have all this grain being brought to the city, and whether it's distributed for free or in the form of bread or sold at subsidized price, also in the form of bread, that is helping to regulate the market. It's pushing prices down, and I think that's an important thing. And you just don't see that happen in Rome after the middle of the 5th century, at least. The church does step in, but it doesn't have the same capacity as the empire in the 4th century. So I think that, let's say, the fragmentation of the West, the decline of imperial structures in the West, they happen at the same time, and they are related to this increased impact of poverty drivers. I'm sorry for rephrasing your question, but I think that's fair to how I see it. Now, a link between poverty in late antique Rome and crime and or banditry, that's an interesting question, Mark. It's very difficult to quantify that because our evidence is so poor. I mean, we do have references in texts to banditry being an issue, but whether that is because you have more poverty, I think that's really difficult to demonstrate. It's very hard to demonstrate. You know, if you have more money, you can arm yourself better, for starters. So that's you can have horses that allow you to attack shepherds taking or the Suari bringing pigs to Rome. So I think it's there are all these laws in the Theodosian Code about people in the south of Italy not being allowed to own horses. That's why I'm thinking of that, because I'm trying to make sense of that law. So I think it's very difficult to demonstrate a correlation between the two elements, poverty and banditry. I think we modern people would assume that, but I think we have to be very careful whether we're talking about modern cities or ancient realities.
Okay, I guess we've been squeezing you enough for the day. Thank you for answering all our questions. And it's time to supply both yourself and everyone else in the room, reach or pool, with some extra liquids. So please stay with us for further discussion over aperitivo. And I mean, we've already done another round of applause for Carlos. So I guess that's enough for the day.
Thank you.